1942. The entire world is at war. The Axis and the Allied forces are bombing non-stop. We are in the midst of the biggest conflict in history, a war which will cause almost 50 million deaths. In Rome, the Pope, Pius XII, is confined to his palace, far from the chaos of war. As the spiritual leader to hundreds of millions of Catholics around the world, he must guide the Church through one of the darkest periods of our history. Because 1,000 kilometers away, in Poland, Hitler has already begun carrying out his gruesome plan: the extermination of all Jews in Europe, whom he would gas to death in concentration camps, all carried out in top secret. And yet the Pope is well aware, as he is one of the most well-informed men on the planet. The world awaits any kind of grand gesture or speech condemning these atrocities.
Sa seule arme, c'est la parole. La seule façon pour un pape de peser sur les événements, c'est de parler.
But the Pope remains silent. Surely, in principle, Nazism and Catholicism are fundamentally opposed.
C'est deux planètes complètement différentes. Si vous lisez Mein Kampf, vous comprenez qu'il y a quand même peu de points communs avec l'Évangile.
Excluding their points in common with Hitler, the Catholic Church will find that. As early as the 1930s onwards, dozens of priests become Nazis. The Vatican will let it happen. The Church will even make a pact with the Führer by signing an international agreement.
Pie XI a toujours dit, bien avant l'arrivée d'Hitler, qu'il signerait un concordat avec le diable en personne s'il fallait, si c'était nécessaire pour sauver les intérêts de l'Église.
You will discover the story of certain men of the Church, fervent admirers of Hitler, who championed the cross of Christ as well as the swastika.
Il terminait ses sermons au nom du Père, du Fils et du Saint-Esprit, à Hitler, ce qui n'est pas tout à fait dans le droit canon romain. Et il avait aussi une autre phrase, c'était Adolf Hitler comme notre prophète Jésus-Christ, ce qui est un peu original.
After the war, networks within the Vatican will help the biggest Nazi criminals to escape Europe. Among them, Josef Mengele and Klaus Barbie.
We're talking about criminal activity here. Yeah? I think we should point this out in this case. It's not just about forgiveness and clemency, helping somebody who is in hiding, giving him some food, yeah? But organizing new papers under false identity for Holocaust perpetrators trying to avoid justice by Italian authorities and Allied authorities. This goes far beyond to be the Good Samaritan.
This is the story we are about to tell you. The story of an institution that many thought to be above all suspicion. The story of their fall into collusion with evil itself. All ambiguity of the links between the Vatican and Nazism had begun well before the Second World War. To understand this, we must go back to the beginning of the 1930s. More precisely, January the 30th, 1933. Hitler had just been elected Chancellor of Germany. But this is not enough for him. His goal is to impose a dictatorship. To accomplish this, Hitler must change the constitution, and to do that he must have 2/3 of the vote of the Reichstag representatives. His one hope is to have a political party, one that holds great power within the assembly. The Zentrum, 100 or so centrist representatives, Catholic representatives.
Hitler doit, s'il veut être un totalitaire, comme il le prétend, il doit rallier à son régime ce pilier de la société weimarienne que constituent les catholiques ou que constitue l'Église catholique. Parce qu'il a besoin de restaurer une forme d'unanimité sur laquelle va se construire le totalitarisme.
But the problem is, in principle, that it would be impossible for the Church to give its voice to Hitler. Nazism and Catholicism are fundamentally opposed.
L'Évangile, c'est d'abord l'accueil de l'autre, aimez-vous les uns les autres, etc. C'est pas un appel au meurtre collectif et des appels guerriers au nom d'une nation qui serait une nation exceptionnelle entourée de sous-hommes.
But more is needed to discourage Hitler. If he wants full powers, he must convince at all costs the Zentrum.
Hitler va chercher à gagner les catholiques en multipliant des discours élogieux sur l'idée chrétienne. Il va promettre d'édifier son nouveau Reich, ce troisième Reich, sur des bases chrétiennes.
But these fine words will not be enough to appease the German Catholics. However, everything is at stake. So here is the Führer's plan. It's not only the German Catholics that he needs to seduce, but their leader, the Pope himself. From the outset, this mission seems to be a lost cause, and yet we see that on the Vatican side, the idea will be rather welcomed. We find ourselves in Rome, Italy. Wedged inside the capital, the Vatican City, the Catholic Church's seat of power. At its head, since 1922, the Pope Pius XI. A pope with an obsession to sign an agreement with Germany to protect the interests of German Catholics.
Des négociations pour aboutir à un concordat du Reich avaient été ouvertes avec la République allemande par le Saint-Siège depuis 1919. Et alors, ça avait commencé, ça avait avorté, mais il n'y avait pas encore de concordat du Reich. Et à peu près chaque fois qu'un nouveau gouvernement allemand était formé, eh bien, c'était relancé soit par le Saint-Siège, soit par le gouvernement allemand. Et évidemment, l'échange était toujours le même, c'est-à-dire je te donne un concordat, mais en échange, le parti catholique me soutient au Reichstag.
Hitler could thus agree to sign the Concordat on the condition that he had the assured backing of the full powers. And it seems that the idea of negotiating with the Führer does not repel the Pope. Because for Pius XI, Hitler is not yet the devil. He sees him, above all, as a fierce anti-communist. A man who could prevent Stalin from invading Europe and suffocating the Church, the Vatican's incessant fear.
Quand Hitler arrive au pouvoir, Pie XI ne pense pas que ce soit nécessairement catastrophique et pour une part anticommunisme. N'oubliez pas, il arrive au pouvoir en 1933. 1933, c'est le moment où Staline saigne à blanc l'Ukraine. Ça fait des années que les bolcheviks sont au pouvoir, ils ont anéanti le catholicisme en Russie, qui n'était pas grand-chose. Et vous voyez arriver Hitler débordant de déclarations d'anticommunisme, le pape se dit pourquoi pas.
Cet anticommunisme virulent d'Hitler va jouer un rôle dans les illusions que va nourrir le pape à l'égard d'Hitler.
To negotiate with Hitler, the Pope sends one of his closest associates, Eugenio Pacelli. He's the Secretary of State. He's the number 2 of the Vatican City. And the Pope had chosen him for this high-risk mission because he knows Germany very well. He was ambassador for the Vatican for 13 years, a strategic post.
Vous imaginez à l'époque, au tout début des années 30, l'importance des relations entre le Saint-Siège, représenté par le nonce apostolique, le jeune Eugenio Pacelli, et l'Allemagne, qui est le plus important pays catholique du monde.
But the Concordat is far from being signed. Elsewhere in Germany, the Zentrum have just decided on a policy full of implications. On March the 23rd, 1933, in Berlin at the Reichstag, the German Catholics have voted to give full powers to Hitler. The Führer now has free rein to impose his dictatorship. It's impossible for historians to know in what ways the Vatican and Eugenio Pacelli put pressure on the Zentrum.
On ne sait pas s'il y a eu promesse ou pas, mais on sait bien qu'il est pratiquement impossible que la question du concordat n'ait pas été au moins discutée. Et elle devient un élément parmi d'autres du vote des pleins pouvoirs.
Il n'y a pas de document probant, sinon une note du prédécesseur de Pacelli à la secrétaire d'État, qui était le cardinal Gaspari, et qui écrit une note en 4 points et qu'il transmet par voie interne au cardinal Pacelli pour dire qu'il faut aller de l'avant avec les négociations concordataires, et que si possible, il ne faut pas hésiter à, si le gouvernement allemand le demande, de sacrifier le parti des catholiques. Donc ce qui prime, c'est l'intérêt supérieur de l'Église et pas l'intérêt du parti des catholiques allemands.
Several days later, the German Church will once again give Hitler what he wants, allowing Catholics to also be Nazis. 2 years earlier, the bishops had banned this. Only, with the desire to sign the Concordat, the Church will give in. From the 28th of March 1933, German Catholics can officially be Nazis. Dozens of priests will thus join the NSDAP, the Hitlerite party. At the Vatican, no one can see anything left to say. Quite the contrary.
Donc lorsque la condamnation du parti est levée par les évêques, le nonce en Allemagne et au Vatican et le secrétaire Pacelli sont plutôt soulagés qu'on ait enfin retiré cette condamnation, parce qu'enfin cette levée de la condamnation ouvre la voie donc aux négociations concordataires.
But will the Vatican really dare to sign an international agreement with the Nazis? Especially as in Rome, during the negotiations with Hitler, the Pope receives some worrying information about the situation in Germany. The Jews there are being persecuted. Their shops are being boycotted. They are excluded from all public employment, ousted from the economy. The Führer is putting in place the first anti-Semitic measures that will become the foundation of his policies. Voices are raised to warn the Vatican. Among them, an outraged woman writes a letter to the Pope. She pleads him to intervene. Her name is Edith Stein. Her journey is surprising. Edith was born into a Jewish family. She is an intellectual and a feminist. She has, unlike most other women of this period, a doctorate and is a professor at Münster. At 30 years old, Edith Stein converts to Catholicism. She is recognized as a woman of profound faith and an exemplary life. In April 1933, this is the beginning of her letter.
Holy Father, as a child of the Jewish people who has become by the grace of God a child of the Catholic Church 11 years ago, I dare to express to the Father of Christianity what is tormenting millions of Germans.
C'est une lettre qui est très forte, puisqu'elle demande, elle explique la situation d'injustice, d'inhumanité que vivent les Juifs d'Allemagne.
Through its call to boycott, the government is pushing many people to desperation. I was aware of 5 suicide cases following these attacks. I am persuaded that this is hinting at a general phenomenon that will take still many more victims.
But above all, Edith Stein pleads the Pope to intervene. If he doesn't, she threatens, he would be an accomplice to these horrors.
The responsibility falls in large part upon those who have pushed them to this extremity. It also falls upon those who remain quiet on the subject. We fear the worst for the image of the Church if it continues to remain silent.
C'est une très belle lettre, très courte, très dense, mais très intense au fond, où elle dit la responsabilité de ces actes ne retombera pas seulement sur ceux qui les ont commis, mais aussi sur ceux qui se seront tus.
Et elle finit par demander, par prier Pie XI de dire quelque chose en expliquant que tous les regards des Juifs et des catholiques d'Allemagne et du monde sont tournés vers la papauté.
The Pope receives this letter on his desk and he will read it, but he will choose not to do anything. His only response was to let Edith Stein know that he'd asked for God's blessing for her. In fact, without knowing it, Edith Stein had sent her letter to the Vatican at the worst possible time.
Elle l'envoie vraiment au moment où on négocie le concordat. Donc, sa lettre probablement touche, on peut l'imaginer, le pape, mais l'urgence n'est pas là. L'urgence, c'est de négocier le concordat. Très rapidement, l'urgence, ça devient on sauve ce que l'on peut sauver, et ce qu'on va essayer de sauver, c'est l'action catholique. Donc, il n'y a pas de place dans cette configuration mentale, politique, diplomatique de l'époque, de ce printemps 33, pour une intervention en faveur des Juifs.
The Vatican will soon be reassured. Eugenio Pacelli was about to finalize this concordat that he so desired. Hitler accepted the terms of the agreement. Rome, 20th of July 1933. Around the table, next to Pacelli, representing the Pope, Franz von Papen, the Vice-Chancellor of the Reich. He represents the Führer. This agreement, which contains 34 articles, is a relief for the Vatican. It assures them officially the respect of the rights of German Catholics, as stated in Article 1. Article 1. The German Reich guarantees freedom of profession and public exercising of the Catholic religion. It recognizes the right of the Catholic Church to organize and administer its affairs autonomously. But in reality, the real winner of this international treaty is Hitler. The Church offered, on a silver platter, the final piece he was missing, the stature of a true head of state.
Pour un gouvernement comme le gouvernement nazi, le fait d'arriver à signer un concordat avec le pape, avec le Saint-Siège, à peine 6 mois après son arrivée au pouvoir, c'est quand même peut être considéré comme un succès politique, diplomatique, indiscutablement. Ça donne à Hitler et au gouvernement nazi une sorte de respectabilité morale sur le plan international.
Aux yeux du monde et aux yeux des catholiques allemands, le concordat signifie bien que le Vatican a réussi à s'accorder avec Hitler.
Le Saint-Siège fait figure d'autorité morale. Vous voyez, donc si ce Saint-Siège si respectable signe un concordat avec Hitler, c'est la preuve qu'Hitler ne peut pas être aussi méchant qu'on nous le dit.
But this honeymoon period between the Vatican and the Nazis will not last long. Hitler wants to position himself as a dictator. Very quickly, he violates the Concordat. He dismantles the organizations of the Church and arrests, and sometimes assassinates, Catholic opponents. At the same time, he attacks the Jews once again with a new arsenal of anti-Semitic measures, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. The Jews lose their German nationality and most of their civil rights. Mixed marriages are forbidden. In Rome, Pope Pius XI is not ignoring these persecutions. 4 years after having entered into a pact with the Führer, the Pope becomes disillusioned. He comes to realize who Hitler really is. So for the first time, he decides to confront him. His weapon, a prosecution speech against Nazism. Mit brennender Sorge, in English, with burning concern.
Le fait même qu'en 1937, à un moment où il n'y a plus de liberté en Allemagne, une prise de parole publique hostile au nazisme, en soi, est un acte qui est pratiquement révolutionnaire en 1937, parce qu'il n'y a plus, lorsqu'on ne peut plus écrire librement, lorsqu'on ne peut plus parler librement, lorsque quelqu'un ose dire une parole de vérité, en cela, elle met à mal le régime.
This impactful text is prepared in utmost secrecy. The censorship of the Nazi regime is omnipresent.
Il a fallu ruser, il y a eu des histoires incroyables. On a imprimé le texte en allemand dans des imprimeries allemandes, mais des petites imprimeries dans certaines régions où on était effectivement sûr que les amis catholiques du coin allaient jouer le jeu, dans un secret absolu. Les premiers exemplaires ont quitté Rome dans la valise ou dans la sacoche de prêtres qui étaient discrètement planqués dans un compartiment de train en espérant que personne n'allait fouiller ses affaires. C'est un vrai roman d'espionnage.
The 21st of March 1937, the text is read in all the churches in Germany. Hitler does not react, but from now on, to the eyes of the world, Pius XI appears to be a challenger to Nazism. Only it is not him who will lead the church when the war begins. Will then the Vatican dare to defy Hitler and play its role as defender of humanity while an entire people get exterminated? March 1939, just 3 months before the war. In Rome, a new pope has just been elected. Pius XI died of a heart attack, and the new pontiff is far from being a stranger. He has chosen the name Pius XII. In reality, his name is Eugenio Pacelli, the Vatican's former number 2. This man's entrance into power will mark a halt in the political battle of his predecessor against Hitler, because Pius XII himself is a man that is far more careful.
D'un côté, il est vrai que l'on élit le bras droit de Pie XI, celui qui a donc fait avec Pie XI toute la politique du Saint-Siège durant toutes les années 30. D'un autre côté, on sait aussi que Pacelli a un caractère assez différent d'Achille Ratti, de Pie XI, qu'il a un tempérament beaucoup moins autoritaire, ou en tout cas qu'il n'est pas du genre à taper du poing sur la table comme le faisait Pie XI.
Foncièrement, c'est un diplomate, donc qui croit... qui est par nature enclin à toujours rechercher le compromis, l'entente, plutôt que le conflit, au fond, et qui pense que les problèmes peuvent se résoudre par la voie de l'entente, la discussion, du compromis.
Except that while Hitler prepares his final solution, the voice of compromise will not suffice.
À partir de janvier 1942, donc la conférence de Wannsee, la guerre change de nature puisque on ne se contente plus à ce moment-là d'envahir des pays et de se battre armée contre armée, mais on va exterminer un peuple.
To accomplish this, Hitler puts in place a true industrial process. Jews are arrested by the hundreds of thousands during big raids. They are brutally packed into overflowing animal trucks and driven towards Poland to specially designed death camps on a massive scale where the majority of Jews would be gassed to death. This genocide had to take place in top secret. In principle, it was impossible for the Pope to know about these atrocities committed by the Nazis. Except in reality, Pius XII will very soon know. Because the Church, omnipresent in Europe, is a vast network of information. Wherever there is a Catholic, there is a potential spy in the service of the Vatican.
Il a d'abord le réseau ses ambassadeurs. À Paris, à Munich, à Berlin, à Madrid, il a des ambassadeurs. Donc il est déjà très bien informé par ses ambassades. Et puis surtout, il a le réseau des évêques. Ces évêques sont forcément une mine d'informations exceptionnelle. Et puis ajoutez les catholiques eux-mêmes qui sont très très bien informés sur ce qui se passe chez eux. Donc voilà 3 sources d'information. La source diplomatique, la source épiscopale et la source, je dirais, pastorale, qui font que le pape, en effet, est probablement le dirigeant le mieux informé de l'époque.
Et donc il y a une masse d'informations qui arrivent. Donc on commence quand même à percevoir qu'il se passe quelque chose de monstrueux à l'Est, sans toutefois en avoir la preuve formelle.
But this official proof the Pope will very soon receive. Like in March 1942, with this report coming from the Jewish World Congress. In this report is a highly detailed index of the exterminations, country by country. The exact figures given show 92,000 Bessarabian Jews executed by the Nazis. Later, the Pope will receive confirmation of this alarming news, this time by the Polish government in exile. In regards to the number of Polish Jews exterminated by the Germans, we estimate that it has surpassed 1 million. It is primarily the elderly, the disabled, women and children who are taken, which is proof that this is not deportation for work, but that the deportees are being put to death using various methods in places specially created for this purpose. All of these reports urge Pius XII to condemn Hitler. The Pope is seen as the person who could change the course of history.
Il a évidemment ni armes atomiques, ni armée, ni puits de pétrole, ni territoire à défendre. Donc il n'existe pas sur le plan politique. Sa seule arme, c'est la parole. La seule façon pour un pape de peser sur les événements, c'est de parler. C'est ça qu'on appelle une autorité morale.
But for the time being, the Pope has decided to keep quiet. He is not the only one to have received these reports. The Allies have also been informed. On December the 17th, 1942, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin publish a declaration, a searing text in which they clearly identify the Jews as the target of Nazis. In every country under German occupation, the Jews are being transported on trains in horrific conditions with inconceivable brutality. The number of victims of these bloody acts of cruelty are hundreds upon hundreds of completely innocent men, women and children. We condemn in no uncertain terms this bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination. Now that the whole world knows, the Pope no longer has a choice. He must speak. A severe, unequivocal condemnation is expected. On the 24th of December 1942, as the Sovereign Pontiff begins his traditional Christmas speech, an entire people is waiting. But they are going to be disappointed, as Pope Pius XII barely speaks on the matter at all. In a lengthy speech of over an hour, the issues of the Jews is addressed in one single sentence, during which he does not even specifically name them. He simply alludes to the
le quali senza veruna colpa propria, talora solo per ragioni di nazionalità o di stirpe, sono destinate alla morte o ad un progressivo deperimento.
Il ne prononce pas le mot juif dans son radiomessage, ce qui évidemment aujourd'hui paraît étrange et lui a valu bien sûr des reproches.
Les Juifs auraient souhaité une dénonciation solennelle et retentissante du génocide et qu'ils ne l'ont pas obtenue.
Ce silence restera à jamais.
So how to explain this silence? A silence that, once again, threw a dark veil over the Vatican. Pius XII would have been nervous about retaliation. because in Holland, a few months earlier in July 1942, the public condemnation of Nazism by a group of bishops had devastating effects.
Les évêques hollandais ont publié une lettre pastorale, vous voyez, qui dénonçait le sort fait aux Hollandais juifs, vous voyez, en disant qu'il y avait là une persécution, que c'était inadmissible. Et en fait, la réaction allemande a été limpide. Jusqu'à cette date-là, les Juifs baptisés, les Juifs chrétiens, étaient exemptés de la déportation. Quand les nazis ont su que les évêques catholiques dénonçaient leur politique à l'égard des Juifs, leur première réaction a été de faire déporter les Juifs de confession catholique.
Une semaine après, des centaines de catholiques d'origine juive ont été emmenés à Auschwitz et gazés immédiatement.
Amongst the victims, there was Edith Stein. Remember, this German woman who 9 years earlier had written the famous letter to the Pope begging him to break his silence. According to certain specialists, the tragic event in Holland would have weighed heavily on Pius XII.
Le pape, quand il entend ce compte-rendu-là, quand on lui dit ça, évidemment, il faut se mettre à sa place. Il se dit, mais si moi je dis la même chose, alors qu'est-ce qui va se passer? Ça sera plus la Hollande, ça va être quoi? Toute la France, ou toute l'Allemagne, ou toute l'Europe?
But that is not the only reason. Something else also paralyzes the Church. The Catholics are not hugely fond of the Jews, and this is nothing new.
Toute l'Église a été coupable, les catholiques, coupables d'un anti-judaïsme qui n'est pas donc un antisémitisme, parce qu'il ne touche pas du tout à la biologie. Là, il ne s'agit pas du tout de racisme. Il s'agit d'un ressentiment, d'un mépris, d'une concurrence que les chrétiens ont parfois violemment, parfois brutalement, exercé à l'égard des Juifs depuis 2000 ans.
La Bible véhicule, si l'on veut, l'idée que c'est l'ensemble du peuple juif qui est responsable et qui doit supporter la faute de la décision d'avoir voulu la mort du Christ. Cette idée est véhiculée et va nourrir, si l'on veut, un sentiment populaire, une hostilité populaire, si l'on veut, à l'égard du peuple juif.
This contempt, this anti-Judaism, the Jews will pay the price for this once again a few months later. But this time, the persecution will happen practically on the Pope's doorstep. We're in the Jewish ghetto in Rome, in the western part of the city. On the night of the 15th to the 16th of October 1943, the sound of German military boots approaches. The Gestapo enters the ghetto through the Via del Portico d'Ottavia. They arrest 1,259 people, 200 of whom are children. The majority of those are deported to Auschwitz and will be gassed. Only 15 people will survive. Pius XII, yet again, keeps quiet. No public condemnation. No symbolic gesture of compassion.
Ce qui peut être davantage reproché à Pie XII, c'est le fait d'être resté chez lui au Vatican au moment de la rafle des Juifs de Rome. Alors ça l'a pas empêché d'essayer de prendre position, d'essayer de négocier avec les autorités allemandes, de réclamer que cesse cette rafle. Mais il n'est pas sorti du Vatican pour descendre dans le ghetto comme il l'a fait lorsqu'il est descendu dans le quartier de San Lorenzo, qui est le quartier qui est bombardé par les Alliés.
3 months before the rounding up of the Jewish ghetto, Rome was bombed, causing 1,600 deaths. At that moment, Pius XII rushed to the centre of the crowds to comfort the Romans, the majority of whom were Catholic.
Il faudra beaucoup de temps pour que le Vatican comprenne qu'il ne peut pas intervenir que pour les seuls catholiques, mais qu'il doit intervenir aussi pour le genre humain.
Of course, the Pope hid hundreds of Jews, even inside his own private residences. But he would not publicly speak out to encourage his flock to follow suit. However, in Rome, more than 4,000 Jews were hidden in convents and monasteries. Risking their lives, Catholics allowed entire families to be saved. In other words, many believers did not wait for a message from Pius XII. They acted on their own conscience.
Il me semble que l'échec de Pie XII, c'est à ce niveau-là qu'il s'est joué, parce qu'il n'a pas su, justement, inventer le geste ou le mode de parole qui, dans l'Europe du temps, aurait eu de l'importance.
The problem is that in the absence of a clear course of action from their spiritual leader, other Catholics then chose the dark side. And this led to mistakes and misconduct. Berlin in October 1943. Today, a new issue of the biggest Nazi propaganda magazine is being released. A newspaper translated into 25 languages, with 2.5 million copies published and distributed throughout occupied Europe. Signal. And on the front page this month, the German soldier in uniform standing right next to the eagle and the swastika. But this man is not German. He is French. His name, Mayol de Loupé. And even more astonishing, although he is wearing the uniform of the Waffen-SS, he is first and foremost a Catholic bishop. This man, so willingly lending his image to Hitler, is proof that Catholicism and Nazism can be compatible. This is a godsend for the Führer, who takes the opportunity to plaster it all around Europe.
Les nazis sont plutôt païens et la religion pour eux, c'est vraiment source. Ça peut être une opposition aux nazis parce que du fait de leur paganisme. Donc, de montrer que des catholiques se battent avec eux, c'est gagnant pour les Français, les Italiens et d'autres catholiques à travers l'Europe, les Espagnols aussi. Montrer que Dieu est avec eux, qu'on est du bon côté. Les nazis sont du bon côté. Pour ça, c'est important. En termes de propagande, c'est important, oui.
Mayol de Loupé is part of this Nazi turning point at the start of the 30s. He has a long-standing obsession, Bolshevism, and most definitely shares his hatred of the Reds with the Hitlerite regime. And also, he shares this hatred with the Vatican, since the Vatican never ceases to condemn communism, much more so than it condemns the Führer.
Tant du côté du pape que du côté des évêques, des catholiques. On entend depuis le milieu du XIXe siècle que le mal, c'est le communisme. Ça devient évidemment le bolchevisme. Depuis le début de la Révolution russe, le pape a pris plusieurs fois la parole pour dénoncer l'idéologie communiste, pour dénoncer les crimes du communisme. Donc, il est évident que cet anticommunisme, nourri par les événements eux-mêmes, va certainement jouer un rôle dans l'attirance de certains pour le nazisme, qui se pose comme un parti anticommuniste.
Except Mayol de Loupé will not just be attracted by Nazism. In the name of anti-Bolshevism, he is ready to actively lend a hand to Hitler, in the hope that this will help the Church to finally get rid of the Reds. And soon he will have just the opportunity. We are in the Soviet Union in the winter of 1941. For months, the country has been fighting the bloody German invasion in Operation Barbarossa. 4 million Axis soldiers have invaded the USSR by surprise. But the war is brutal. Hitler needs more men. He is recruiting from all over the occupied territories, but the French are unwilling. The Führer must find them a solution.
L'intérêt de l'armée allemande, c'est que tout se passe bien. Et comme elle sait que pour des Français, être sous uniforme allemand, ça pose un problème quand même. C'est pour ça qu'ils embauchent Mayol de Loupé. C'est pour atténuer les problèmes et puis pour servir de recruteur aussi, de dire voilà, moi je suis prêtre, j'y vais en grand uniforme, pourquoi pas vous, ayez confiance en moi. Donc, comme ce sont souvent des milieux catholiques et un peu réactionnaires, ils font confiance à monsieur le curé.
The problem is that Maille-de-Loupé needs the authorization of the church. But apparently one of their bishops joining Hitler's side does not pose any problem. Not for Cardinal Suard, his superior in Paris, a close friend of Maréchal Pétain. He gives him his permission without batting an eyelid. Not even for the Vatican, who Maille-de-Loupé contacts through Monsignor Sibilia, a cardinal close to Pius XII. He sends him his authorization and even his blessing. In October 1941, Maille-de-Loupé leaves for the front line, along with hundreds of French youth and Nazis. Their trains are covered in explicit slogans. Death to the Jews, Heil Hitler. At nearly 70 years old, the new crusader finds himself as a military chaplain on the Russian plains. His mission? To spew out his party line. Amen Hitler.
Le dimanche, jour du Seigneur, donc forcément des messes sont organisées. C'est Maille-de-Loupé bien sûr qui officie. Et effectivement, il faut ces grandes messes sur le mysticisme du nazi, sur la justesse de la cause. On combat le bolchevisme, on combat l'ennemi rouge. Et effectivement, ils terminaient, on a su ça par des survivants qui l'ont raconté, ils terminaient ces sermons au nom du Père, du Fils et du Saint-Esprit, Heil Hitler, ce qui n'est pas tout à fait dans le droit canon romain, donc c'est un peu hétérodoxe. Et il avait aussi une autre phrase, c'était Adolf Hitler comme notre prophète Jésus-Christ. C'était pour justifier l'injustifiable, quoi. Donc l'engagement des Français sur place, Maille-de-Loupé n'était pas à s'encombrer à quelques formalités près.
In total, Maille-de-Loupé will spend almost 3 years on the Eastern Front. He then settles in Germany until the end of the war. As the Allies arrive, he hides in a monastery, but is quickly found and arrested. At the end of his trial, Maille-de-Loupé will serve 4 years in prison for enemy intelligence. In theory, with the defeat of the Germans, one could think that this would also put an end to these somewhat clouded Church-Nazi relationships. But you will see that in reality, even years after the fall of Hitler, some very highly positioned men in the Vatican will enter into outright complicity, organizing the escape of war criminals. We return to Rome. The war is over. The Italians too have discovered the unbearable images of the millions of victims of the just liberated extermination camps. There is utter disbelief. In the Vatican, the Pope still has not reacted publicly, nor has he condemned these horrors. And after 3 years, life has resumed its course. It is 1948. A stone's throw from the Holy See, this is the Via della Pace, the Road of Peace. We are at house number 20, at the headquarters of the German church, Santa Maria dell'Anima. Monsignor Alois Hudal lives here. He runs one of the branches of the Assistant Pontifical Commission, created at the end of the war to welcome refugees.
They wanted to help. They saw the millions of Europeans on the road, on the street, homeless, displaced persons, survivors of the Holocaust. It was very chaotic and very difficult situation in Europe in those years. About more than 20 million people homeless and on the streets. It was a massive problem. And so the Catholic Church, the Vatican, the Pope himself realized we want to do something as well. We want to help these people.
And so on this day, Alois Hudal hears a knock at the door. It's a refugee coming to ask for aid. His name is Franz Stangl. But this man is by no means a refugee like the others. He has the blood of hundreds of thousands of Jews on his hands.
Criminal career really started out when he was involved in the so-called euthanasia killings in Austria. And then he was transferred from a euthanasia killing center to Treblinka extermination camp in Nazi-occupied Poland, where he became the commandant of Treblinka. And in Treblinka, between 1942 and 1943, 1 million people were murdered. And he was one of the main perpetrators of this crime.
After the war, Stangl is arrested and imprisoned in Austria. The law is preparing to judge him, and he knows he faces a heavy sentence. So he escapes in May 1948. And so begins his 1,000-kilometer journey, destination Rome. Stangl has heard that inside the Vatican there is a network that could help him flee Europe. They have even given him a contact, the famous Alois Hudal.
He came to Rome and he knew he had to somehow find this Bishop Hudal. Yeah? He had no real idea where exactly he is, or he didn't even know the correct spelling of his name. And poor, coincidence, he ran into a former comrade, a former SS man that he knew in Rome on the bridge. And, asked, what are you doing here? What a coincidence. Yeah, I'm looking for Hudal. I'm on the way to Hudal. And the former SS man could describe him, could tell him how to find Hudal in the Santa Maria dell'Anima.
In other words, at the Santa Maria dell'Anima church, Hudal not only helps the poor and destitute, he also deals with Nazi criminals and does so with full knowledge of the situation.
Hudal savait. Hudal s'abrite aussi derrière son rôle de prélat, de prêtre allemand, pour dire mais moi je peux pas faire le tri entre les bons et les mauvais, il faut que je les aide, ils viennent chez moi, ils me demandent de l'aide, donc je demande de l'aide.
He knew that Stangl was a mass murderer and a Holocaust perpetrator who killed hundreds of thousands of people.
It should be said that the Bishop Hudal is also an admirer of the Nazi regime.
Hudal a toujours été pro-nazi, en tout cas un allié des nazis. Il a toujours pensé qu'il faisait le lien entre les nazis et les chrétiens allemands. Alors il s'abrite derrière cette bonne volonté-là pour cacher ce qui était en réalité de la complicité avec des criminels de guerre.
Hudal's speciality is supplying passports for war criminals so that they can get out of Europe. And Stangl is in great need of this service. It is in the name of the Vatican and with the help of the Holy See that Hudal will proceed. This here is proof of the document that was procured for him. It is a letter written by the Pontifical Commission with the Vatican coat of arms as a header. It is dated the 17th of August 1948. He is asked to kindly deliver the passport to the following person, Stangl. The request is addressed to the International Red Cross. At the time, Europe is in such chaos that it is the Red Cross who is entrusted with the task of providing passports to refugees who wish to emigrate. But to ensure success, what could be better than a letter like this, with the guarantee of the Vatican?
We know from witnesses, from former officials of the Red Cross in Rome, that priests and Hudal himself asked personally, or went there himself, to ask for travel documents from the Red Cross for a number of people that he wants to help. And of course, in those cases, the officials could not say no. How could they refuse the application of a bishop, of a Catholic bishop in Rome? That's impossible.
The result, a few weeks later, Hudal hands Franz Stangl his passport. It is his guarantee that he will be able to escape justice. However, this war criminal doesn't celebrate, because he was bothered by one small detail.
The papers were not really issued under a false name. they're issued for a certain Paulstangl. So the middle name was turned into the first name. Stangl protested. He told the bishop, you made a mistake. Somebody made a mistake. Maybe the Red Cross or you, because my name is not Paulstangl, my name is Franz Stangl. And Bishop Hudal told him, don't worry, it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, because you realize you're wanted as a war criminal. It's better to be Paulstangl than Franz Stangl, because they're looking for Franz Stangl.
But they would not find him, as the former Nazi left Europe and headed to Syria to start a new life. He would not be found for another 20 years in Brazil, and there he will finally be condemned to lifetime in prison. But Hudal did not just help one war criminal. Numerous others also passed through this Vatican network. Amongst them, the most wanted in Europe, such as Adolf Eichmann, the lead organizer of the death camps, Dr. Mengele, the head doctor of Auschwitz, and Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. Was Pope Pius XII aware of his bishop's schemes? Impossible to know, as the Vatican refuses even today to declassify their records. On the other hand, one report is unequivocal. It is dated back to 1947 and comes from the American Secret Service. Its author, Vincent LaVista.
He did a very good job. He looked into all these structures. He figured out how these people come to Italy over the mountains, through Tyrol very often, the Austrian-Italian border, and then how they stayed in monasteries, how some of them had contacts to former Nazis there or former fascists there, and then how they get to Genoa or to Rome.
And what he discovered was that at the heart of the Vatican, there were numerous members suspected of being involved in the escape of war criminals. 22 in total, many of them bishops. And in very first place is written Monsignor Hudal. His address and even his telephone number are given. Again, it is impossible to know for sure that Pius had any knowledge of this report, but according to experts, it is almost certain.
Un rapport comme ça va évidemment sur le bureau du secrétaire d'État, qui est le Premier ministre du pape. Sauf qu'à cette époque, il n'y a pas de secrétaire d'État, puisque le secrétaire d'État est mort en 1944 et Pie XII n'a pas voulu le remplacer. Pie XII disait, au fond, le secrétaire d'État, c'est moi. À partir de cette boutade du pape lui-même, on peut considérer qu'un rapport important comme celui-là est arrivé sur son bureau. Alors, qu'en a-t-il fait? L'a-t-il lu? L'a-t-il confié à des gens? Qui saura jamais?
In any case, the Pope did not react publicly. At the Vatican, affairs are dealt with internally. Alois Hudal would resign 5 years later, in 1952. Even today, Pius XII is shamed for his silence. All of it. His silence during the genocide, but also his refusal to speak out after the war, and to explain himself when he no longer needed to be in fear of retaliation. It would not be until his death in 1958 that the people would finally hear his regrets. This is how his will opens. Have mercy on me, Lord, and grant me your forgiveness. The knowledge of my weaknesses, failures and sins committed during such a long pontificate, in such terrible times, has revealed my shortfallings and my disgrace. I humbly ask forgiveness of all those I have offended, wronged and outraged.